This one makeup trick actually made photo studies make so much more sense to me after over a decade of painting. So today's video is thanks to all the TikTok girlies. As you guys know, I've been doing the 100 heads challenge for a couple of months now, and I realized that the way I paint studies today is very different to how I used to paint when I first started painting photo studies some 13 years ago. I know, it's been that long. Of course, there's skill improvement, but there are also amazing portrait painting tips that I've picked up over the years with every new painting. So today I want to try and condense as many of these tips into one video for you as I possibly can so that you can paint better, more alive, more vibrant looking portrait studies, as well as create memorable, unique, original faces. This video is great for beginners because we're going to start all the way at the beginning and take a look at how I sketch for likeness, as well as how I pick colors and establish a color palette. And for the more advanced artists, we're going to take a look at things like how you can build up your rendering gradually from scratch, and also some composition tips to round out our painting. As you've probably already seen from the thumbnail, today we're going to study this photo reference of the gorgeous Tom Hiddleston because I thought it was so beautiful, and I'm really excited about how the end product turned out. So if you're excited for this video as well, make sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe to my channel for more art content, and comment below your tips on how to paint better portraits if you have any that I've missed out. But without much further ado, here's exactly how you can paint your best portraits yet. So before we paint, one of the things I've learned more recently is to pick the right reference. I went deeper into this in the first 100 heads video, so I won't bore you with it right now, but there's a couple of very specific reasons why I picked this reference. I really like the subtle drama of a little bit of bright highlight, a little bit of dark shadow, and then two very distinctive bands of mid-tone. The expression is powerful but not loud, and while the colors aren't too saturated or fancy, there's enough hue variation in there to work our color muscles. I like to start by matching the canvas dimensions to the reference so that when it's time to measure positions for our sketch, we have sort of a similar proportions canvas going. For studies, I start with a square canvas where the height and width are around 4K pixels each. I'll then get the reference in a pure rough window and resize it to the same height as the canvas is on the screen. Then I move the pure rough window so the left edges of the reference and the canvas are lined up, and I crop the right edge of the canvas in to match the right edge of the reference. Boom! Now the two are about the same relative proportions. The reason I like to do this is because now we get to use the negative space around his head and shoulders to establish a perimeter or silhouette. So we're not looking for any detail yet. I've just kept the reference right next to the canvas, and I'm trying to use the negative space created by the background to place the outer edges. Estimate where the hairline and chin lie, and based on this specific face, I noticed that if you try to draw a circle down from the edges of the hair, the bottom edge is approximately where the mouth will lie, and about halfway down his face is where his nose bulb lies. I just did a smaller circle to draw that in because it vaguely indicates the cheekbones as well. These are important because establishing landmarks at this super vague stage allows us to place the facial features in the right places. I usually do an inverted kite shape for the nose, a little line for the mouth. I do eye sockets first, where the top of the socket is where the brows go, and then the ears are usually the same height as the distance between the brows and the base of the nose. If you don't draw faces very regularly, this might seem like a lot of information, but I want you to understand that this is just my system. It works for me. As you draw more heads, you'll find your own specific landmarks that help you place features the best. After indicating the eyes and also a little shape for the highlight on the sides of his face, I roughly drew in the mouth, collarbones, and hair. We're still super rough. I moved the eyes around a little because remember, you can and should change any detail anytime you feel it's off, or it would look better in a different way. I indicated the nostrils and beard and then painted the whole layer orange. This is our first sketch layer. Having it in a different color helps me distinguish between the rough and relatively cleaner sketch. I then lowered the opacity and created a new layer. Now we can zoom in a little bit and start to place the facial features. I'm just trying to match the shapes as best as I can. I started with one eye, putting down the eyelids, iris, and also vaguely indicating a shadow with some scribbles. Then I put down the other eye, though this was a little tricky because some of the innermost corner was lost to the shadow in the reference. The joys of realism, hey? Scribbled in the nose and mouth, the stubble, and some directional lines to indicate how the hair would flow. Now, here's where the makeup tip comes in from TikTok. Something I came across was the idea of high, medium, and low contrast faces. This is about the value of the skin and how different it is to the value of the hair, eyes, and just how the shadows appear on a face based on its bone structure. So an example of a high contrast head is someone like Timothée Chalamet, where there is very dramatic transitions at his hairline and eye socket and such. The flat planes of his face look very different to the shadow tones. Whereas someone like Tom Hardy here has a low contrast face where his skin and hair, his brows, beard and lips, as well as the shadows that naturally occur in his eye socket and around his nose tend to not be too dramatically different. And then you have someone like Will Smith, where there's still some contrast between the values, but there are a bunch of transitional midtones that soften the contrast. This is of a medium contrast. Now, this sort of thing is quite changeable based on things like lighting, makeup, hair dye, etc. But there's a reason why I'm bringing it up in the context of photo studies. This might be why sometimes your sketch looks like a reference, while other times it doesn't. Now, here's the sketch that we've got, and here's our reference turned grayscale. I'd say Tom here has a sort of medium contrast going, where there's still a notable value difference, but the values transition into each other gradually. Our sketch, however, has very dark lines against a very bright background. The sketch may have the right shapes and sizes, but it is inherently very high contrast, so it might not match the reference too well. In fact, if I further lower the contrast in the reference, the sketch seems to match it even less. But if I up the contrast on the reference image and make those value transitions sharper, that's a much better match than the original reference. You'll likely find that with some faces you can absolutely nail the sketch. Those are likely your high contrast references, and the harder it is to match your sketch to your reference, the lower the facial contrast likely is. I can't tell you how much of a weight this has taken off my shoulders. It's not that I'm a horribly inconsistent artist, it's just that people come in a bunch of different contrast levels. Alright, I just thought I'd mention that so you guys can stop giving yourself grief about it, and also it might help you sketch better. Now we can start putting in some colors. This is where Pure Ref really shines because you can zoom, pan, and flip the reference as much as you like, and it has an always on top mode. Not sponsored by PureRef, it's a free app and I love it so much. When I start coloring, I first like to flatten the big colors by dragging and zooming in on each tone on the reference to the edge of the PureRef window, then color matching on my canvas right next to the reference so it's as seamless as possible. I always like to match my colors by sight, I say this all the time, rather than color picking off the reference directly, because it helps me get a feel of the color palette, the predominant temperature and saturation, and it is also just really good exercise for the brain. I started with the background, then picked a base midtone for the skin and flattened it on its own layer. Then I did one layer for the shadow side of the hair and another under it for the slightly lighter areas in the hair. Having everything on separate layers means we get to use clipping groups and paint within the lines when it comes to rendering. The cleaner you can keep your layers, the easier rendering will be, but also don't feel like you need to do an insane number of layers if you don't want to. I actually ended up clipping the sketch into the skin layer and painting it a slightly darker brown than the midtone. We're gonna paint over the sketch, and I accidentally rendered so much of the face and realized I wasn't even recording, but I want to show you guys how I render, and thankfully, since the rendering was on a separate layer, I just deleted it and started over for you. Now, here's another super cool tip that might change your life. You'll see that I started rendering by zooming in and painting one eye, when the usual advice is to go from larger shapes to smaller ones. That is exactly what we're going to do, but I've recently discovered that if you look at your photo reference, there will often be a small area that contains most of the highlight and shadow tones, as well as most of the hue variations that you'll find in the rest of the image concentrated in one place. For this piece, it is the eye on the brighter side of the face, specifically that upper eyelid. It's like the microcosm that echoes the macrocosm of the rest of the face. Why is that helpful to know? Because in rendering that tiny area, what I've now done is given myself a pretty solid palette to color pick from while I paint the rest of the face. So you'll see me now zoom out and grab the shadow tones in the eye socket and use that to now start working on the larger areas on the shadow side of the face. Obviously, we'll add a bunch of other colors in, but this is a super quick way to start. And especially seeing as this is a medium contrast face and knowing full well that I have a tendency to go too far with the value contrast, we've established that by now, I definitely wanted to start slow and steady with the shadows and gradually build them up darker and darker. With the rendering, I pretty much just use my custom chalk brush for like 80% of the painting process. I love it, it's pressure sensitive and textured and has just the right balance of grit and blending. It is part of my custom brush pack, link is in the description, of course. Now that we have the midtones in place, we can zoom in and start adding definition. Now, this is where you shut your brain off and go into render mode. Because we've spent so much time setting up a sketch, the flats and the midtones, all of which required a lot of planning and inferring from the reference, it means we get to now just do the legwork. That's not to say that we can zone out completely. Painting is still very much a conscious process, but we don't really need to future plan anymore. We get to live in the present and just enjoy the process. I always say this and I always will, art is in the process. The finished painting is a byproduct. The process is what you do it for. That's when you learn and grow and process emotions and all that good stuff. Coming back to the painting, I have to be honest, his nose was definitely the trickiest part. I don't know if it was the lighting that hits him on one side or the shadows not being harsh or just the overall sculptedness of his nose itself, but the bridge wasn't bridging nor was the bulb bulbing. But I did want to paint it before I did the other eye because some of those shadow tones in the nose made it easier to sort of set the tone for the eye that's in the shadow. I did keep going back to the nose over and over again though. I feel like every painting has a thing that challenges me, which is good because it keeps art from becoming too routine and dull, and here his nose was the thing. The mouth, on the other hand, super simple, pretty much just 2 or 3 colors. Also, like I said earlier, I was aiming for realism here, but stylization habits. The eyes kept turning out too large and I had to constantly liquefy them smaller, especially since this is a masculine face. Larger, rounder eyes tend to soften out the face and make it look more traditionally feminine, and for today I'm just trying to match the reference as closely as I can. Alright, time for big girl pants because we're painting hair, and not just any hair, curly hair, which as we all know is much harder to paint and maintain, don't ask. Now, this is where composition comes in. From so many years of doing style studies, I've learned that one of the best ways in which you can establish a focal point is by using abstract rendering. Here, I want to focus attention on his eyes. There's a subtle sadness to them that really brings this photo to life, so I really wanted the eyes to be the most highly detailed area. So for the hair, we're going more impressionistic and using broader sweeps of the brush to indicate curl clumps as opposed to hand painting each strand. I kept the biggest shapes around his face and then used thinner strokes to create a bit of frizz around the ends. It's a super quick and easy way to create the impression of curly or wavy hair. Thicker clumps at the root, thinner ends as they separate towards the ends of the hair. I then went around with an airbrush, smoothing some values out, deepening the shadows a little more, and softening the transitions in the brighter half of the face. Finally, we can zoom in even more and get into the littler details, things like the hairline, for instance. His hairline isn't super harsh, it's a gradual transition. So the roots are wispy little lines that come into his forehead. One last horizontal flip just to adjust any distortions or angles. Flipping your canvas, as I'm sure you know, helps you see the painting with fresh eyes. When we stare at our canvas for so long, we can get too used to how it looks and not notice glaring errors. When you flip your canvas, it's like hitting refresh on your eyeballs and any errors become a lot clearer. And some final touches like any moles and scars, and here's the finished study. I am so in love with it. So now you can go forth, my children, and paint faces to your heart's content. And when you do, please show me. You can tag me on Instagram, it's at Srish Creates, or you can come show everyone on the Discord server because we're all really nice and really wholesome on there. Of course, if you've enjoyed this video and learned something today, let your girl know by giving it a big thumbs up, and comment below any other topics you'd like me to do a deep dive on like we've done today. Subscribe to my channel for more art content, and you can always come say hello on socials. All my links are in the description. You can always grab extra content such as my custom brush kit that I made from scratch, all of my speed paints from start to finish for all of my paintings, including the bits that I've had to cut out of videos on YouTube due to time constraints. You can grab my entire collection of real-time art and chill painting videos where we can paint along. It's like paint along style tutorials. There's like a whole bunch of those. And there's also prints of my work. It's all on Patreon. I'll leave a link up here in the cards and in the description. And if you just want to grab my brush kit or you just want to buy me a coffee, I'll leave a link to my buy me a coffee page as well in the description. And that's about it for this video. So thank you so much for hanging out with me today. I really hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. If you're looking for more portrait study tips and just digital painting tips for faces, I actually just made a 100 heads challenge playlist at the start of this week. I will leave it here in the outro, probably there, but I'll keep adding to it as we go through this challenge. So if you haven't watched the rest of them yet, check it out, you'll really enjoy it, and I'll see you guys on the next one. Bye.